Okay, here we go. All right, thank you everyone for coming out this evening. And it's definitely not the typical Shabbos Shuva drasha. It's a different context, a different time. It's, as you can tell, most probably it's not Shabbos. That even though our ovens, as we were saying before, and in the preamble, might have Shabbos mode, our Zooms don't. But at the same point in time, I think that it's as important, if not more important than ever, to be able to share together a few words as we go into Pesach this year. I want to give two prefaces if we can. I look forward very much to the Shabbos Shuva drasha and the Shabbos HaGadol drasha each year. I enjoy handing out source sheets, which we go through together. It's a nice environment and a nice vibe. Obviously, things are very different over here. But at the same point in time, I think we live in times where we calibrate in terms of what we present, how we present, why we present it. And as opposed to having a long list of source sheets that we're going to go through, instead we're going to try to present a couple of ideas of framing. I think that so much of what we experienced this year wasn't necessarily an amount of how much information do we have or do we need to get through it. I think one thing we realized is that there was always a tremendous amount of confusion. There's a lack of knowledge, not knowing exactly what to do, what we can't do. And it's in times like those what makes me realize that perhaps maybe the more important thing that we sometimes need is not to figure out the details, but it's more of the overall perspective, the lens, shall we call it the framing. And sometimes if a person understands the framing, they don't have to figure out all of the details in the same way necessarily. If a person understands the big picture in life, in an experience, it takes away the need to have to be able to micromanage or understand every single facet, because they have the tools by which, with their own lens, to be able to, self-approach those things and be able to pull out both the strength and the meaning when necessary without necessarily having all the details. And, it's interesting, you're welcome to answer this in the chat if you want, but, people always look at the seder and have their favorite parts, and, feel free to post it in there. I'm always curious to know what part of the seder a person thinks is their favorite part of the seder, that they like the best, that their kids like the best, that they look forward to the most each year. What's the facet that they really like? And for people are different things. It might be the songs at the end culminating together. It might be the manishta in the beginning. It might be the beginning when the table is set. It might be the dipping with the pinky and the makos. It could be a plethora of different favorites that we have. And I find that very often what happens when we start with the seder is that we come in hungry with an understanding of what are some of the beautiful ideas and what we call vortlach that we can share. And I'd like to approach this Shabbos HaGadol drasha, this discussion, this pre-Pesach preparation, not with a list of, as we've done sometimes in the past, 10, rapid fire ideas to share around your table. And there is so much to do. My daughter called me. She was lucky I happened to be up at 5:55 this morning. So she had called me unbeknownst that I would be up, but luckily I was, saying I'm in this farm store in Israel right now and I want to pick up a Haggadah. What Haggadah should I get? That's an impossible question to answer because there are thousands of Haggadahs probably out there on the market now, and they're all fantastic. There's so much literature that's out there about every single nuance, every single word. But I think what we're going to do this evening together, with your permission, is we're going to approach it in a different light. We're going to take a step back and relearn what it's about. I saw a beautiful pshat on the Tzei Ulamad, so that we make sure at least we have one nugget that's in the Haggadah before we, finish the night. We'll start with it, so we make sure we have one when we hit the Haggadah. We can remember this part. When it says Tzei Ulamad, and the typical understanding of Tzei Ulamad is go out and now start learning, and we go through sources. So the Court of a Rebbe says that Tzei Ulamad actually means something very different. Tzei Ulamad means Tzei, first go out. Go out from where? Go out from what you know, Ulamad, and now start learning. Right? Meaning that if you're going to engage in the process of education, I think it was Mark Twain that said something along the lines of education is mainly the process of unlearning what you learned already. We come with so much baggage, so much understanding, so much perspective that we're so committed to and think this is the right way to see things. And the reality is sometimes what you have to do is you have to come in as a blank slate, as blank as our children are around the table as well. I told the story the other day that there's a rabbi on the East Coast, Rabbi Einhorn. He tells the story when he was signed up to do Kung Fu as a kid. He walked in and the Kung Fu master, Si Fu Wang, had a half full cup of water. right? And whenever you see a half full cup of water, automatically your mind goes towards is the cup half empty or is the cup half full, right? It depends how you look at it. The Kung Fu master's in the front, he's holding this glass. He says, right now, your minds are half full. Takes the cup of water, pours it on the ground. He says, come back tomorrow when your glass is empty. Right? Pretend we were approaching for the very first time the seder. It's hard to do because we look forward to it. But imagine we're leaving Mitzrayim and we have the experience. And it's not like, hey, what did we do last year? We know what we do. We were building pyramids last year. Imagine if it was our first seder, right? Chayev Adam liros es atzmo kilu hu yatsa mitzrayim. It's not us saying, hey, what did we do for thousands of years when we hit the seder? It's a restart, a refresh, a hard reboot of the system saying you're experiencing it now for the first time. And when I thought about that, when we talk about a restart and a reboot, especially in a shul community, I think it's also such an appropriate way to understand this process that we've gone through a year as well. There's a very famous piece over the past year from Rav Hirsch, which wasn't well known beforehand, in his introduction to Chorev, where he talks about what we've actually just experienced this past year. And please God, we will be coming out of it very soon. Rav Hirsch says in the beginning of his Chorev, the introduction where he goes through all of his classification of mitzvos, he says as follows: if I had the power, this is in the 1800s, if I had the power, I would provisionally close, oh, hold on, my computer is not plugged in, so I'm gonna lose my batteries. Hang on, back in business. He says as follows: if I had the power, Rav Hirsch says in the 1800s, I would provisionally close all synagogues for 100 years, right? Not just for a year. I'd shut down the system for 100 years, right? Do not tremble at the thought, right? You get nervous. What happens when shuls close, right? And again, let's caveat. We're going to come back together. He says close them temporarily. He just said maybe you need even 100 years to relearn the process. What would happen when you close down shuls? He says Jews and Jewesses without synagogues, desiring to remain such, would be forced to concentrate on Jewish life and a Jewish home. All of a sudden, when you take away the fact that there's the collective of shul, which has a tremendous importance, but you sit there and say, identity is really built on what's happening in my home. My home is going to turn into the shul. My home is going to turn into the school. My home is going to turn into the Jewish community organization that I'm most involved in on a day-to-day level. And those are the events that I'm going to be a part of around my dining room table. He said, imagine if we shut that down. He says, what would happen? The Jewish officials connected with the synagogue would have to look at the opportunity now open to them, namely to teach young and old how to live a Jewish life and how to build a Jewish home. All synagogues closed by Jewish hands would constitute the strongest protest against the abandonment of the Torah in home and life. He says that there's an opportunity and a challenge, which we've had this past year, to rethink and understand, wait, am I a Jew defined by when I show up or how often I do or don't sometimes show up to synagogue? Or is my life revolved around that? When we think about the phrases that we have in our literature, right? When we're sitting in our homes, when we're getting up, when we're going to bed, right? Obviously being out there is important, but the majority of our lives are spent within our home walls as well. And therefore, again, a Tzei Ulamad aspect is a redefinition of, and I remember in the beginning, I'm sure you remember this as well, there were posts all over about what's going to be my structure, right? My structure, okay, it's our first Shabbos where we can't go to shul, so I'm going to get dressed. I'm going to put on the Shabbos clothes. We're going to have our little minyan service on the back porch in front of whatever. We'll get together. Who's going to be the chazan, the chazanit? What are we going to do? We're going to get there. And we started with that vigor. And then the more I spoke to people, the more you saw that for some, it just kind of over time, became, well, you know what? Sweatpants are sweatpants. And whether I get up at 7 or 8 or whether I dress for Shabbos, it's not like I'm going anywhere, or whether and all of a sudden the challenge of, do we need the scaffolding, the crutches, which is an important aspect. And it was put there to give us the strength. But the reality always has been that the strength of the Jewish people is only as strong as the commitment of the Jewish home. And I think as we start to emerge from this Yetzias Mitzrayim that we've experienced, this Tzei Ulamad is so important for each and every one of us. You know, as was said in the preamble, please God, people are starting to get their vaccines. Things are opening up a little bit. Like Gary said, we were able to have 28 people in a shul, which was such a big kiddush for us. As opposed to having 10 people, we were able to have like 2.5 times that amount. Everyone was safe. Everyone felt comfortable, but there's a certain palpability of what does it mean to re-engage in all these things? What's the purpose and the value of them? And I think that if we approach not only what our life has been like over this time or the Agada, but perhaps the entire Seder in this manner, if we reimagine what exactly is the purpose, we have individuals, in the shul who might be anything from in construction to doctors to event planners to everything in between to teachers. And if you ask anybody what it is that they're going to be doing, the first question they're going to ask if they sit down with a customer or a student or a client or a patient, right? They're going to be like, well, tell us, what's your goal? What do you hope to achieve, right? Somebody comes to, to a health nutritionist, and they say, you got to help me. Well, what do you hope to achieve? Right? Is it weight loss? Is it health? Is it, a stronger heart? Like, depending on what your goal is. I want to have the best, bar mitzvah, the best bat mitzvah ever. Great. What does that mean, best ever? Do you mean you want more bar or do you want more mitzvah? Tell me what your goals are. Then we can design it based on that. I'm looking to have a home. Well, what's the purpose of your home? What do you want it to have? Will there be, will you be hosting? Will you not be hosting? Will it be about books? Will it be about TV? Tell us what's important to you, and then we can design around it. And when we get to the Seder, there's always this, like we said before, this hunger for ideas and specific things to share. Oh, that's a great fort. I'm going to scribble it down. I got to share that. But if we take a step back and say, wait, what are we looking to achieve? There's a beautiful idea by Wolfson where he says that the idea of manishtana isn't really manishtana halayla hazeh mikol haleilos. How is this night different from all other nights? It really is manishtana al yedei halayla hazeh. What will be different because of, as a result of this night? When we sit down at our seders, and whether it happens to be a shorter one because still some people are on their own, right? So it's them just talking with God, or talking to the one person next to them, or whatever the situation is, whether it's an hour, 2 hours, or 5 hours, a person has to always start sof ma'aseh b'machshava tefillah. A person has to know what the end is going to be. What do we hope to achieve? So that we can say after that, you know what? That was successful. Not just that was fun, that was enjoyable, the kids behaved, we got through it, right? I saw something I never saw before, but what really is the goal? And I think if we can answer that question, we don't really need a Haggadah or a rabbi to tell us, well, here's a nice fort, here's a nice fort. All of a sudden, when you know what you're looking for, those things start to jump out at you, and you can see it inside the book itself. The truth is the Haggadah is not such a long sefer. If you put it on small type print, you can fit the whole thing on probably 2 sides. Remember in schools when we used to be able to have cheat sheets, they say you can bring in 1 cheat sheet, double-sided, whatever you can write on that 1 sheet. And then when computers came out, students would have like font 4 size. So it'd be tiny. They'd get everything from the semester on there. You can try this. The Haggadah, which say, oh, it's such a long night. There's so much. It fits onto 1 double-sided sheet. That's what they wrote. We have to invest in that meaning, but the bones, the skeleton of what we're looking to draw out is just inside that text. And we have the power and the ability, if we have the right lens, to be able to pull it out from there. And I think that that's for that reason and many others, but what we engage in is what's called seder, right? What does seder mean? Seder means order, structure. Right? What's exactly the process we're looking to get through? And there's a beautiful line that Rabbi Yerucham has in the beginning of his commentary on Torah, where he says, "V'chi adam she'eno baal seder." He's referring to just the way a person studies life in general. He says a person who isn't a baal seder, a master of seder, means a master of order and structure, hu lo adamhu. It's not really a person. Right? They're just sort of flailing around. They're trying to grasp on, oh, that's a good idea. Maybe that one will work with my kids this year. That's a great idea. Maybe that one will inspire me, Rabbi, so I can keep going. Oh, that's a nugget that I can hold on. And those are all just grasping at straws, which are good while you're holding it, but it doesn't create the lens and the framework by which. And therefore, what we call this little shiur tonight, right, of which we're already setting the stage for what the hope is to achieve, it was believe me. That's the purpose of the whole Seder. Right? We could have an entire night just talking about the way we can translate that one line alone. So first, believe me, right? That is the point of the entire Seder, right? To understand that there's a structure, there's a goal, there's something we're looking to achieve, there's an outcome that we have to come with, and we have to go into that Seder experience, right? Especially this year more than others, not just because of the challenge, but the opportunity, right? So many times we feel like, you know what, everyone around the table is talking about this, or I got to deal with Uncle that that's grumpy and wants to eat, or this person's not behaving. It's a much more contained, controlled environment. I remember, Mom, you can, my mother's on here, I believe, and my father, I think it's just my mother's name that's on the window. But I remember one year where I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Mom, but I don't think you type up on these things. It was just me and the both of you, my mother and my father. For whatever reason, we had a Seder. I remember where we went for the second Seder, but for whatever reason, it just turned out. And truth be told, I don't know what they were thinking. I'm not sure we ever discussed this. I hope I don't get in trouble saying this, but I remember thinking like, oh yeah, this is going to be really lame. Like this is just going to be the three of us. Like this is not exactly what we're looking forward to. My brothers were in Israel and New York I don't remember where anybody was. It was just the three of us. And that evening, for some reason, was so special, and it still stays with me that I remember that time, because so much of the noise and the distraction and the having to juggle between the hosting or being hosted or different timelines is sort of stripped away. And therefore, it really is just a challenge. It is mentally. But if we take that approach and say, you know what, here's an opportunity as well. There's a goal that has to be achieved. We have the clarity and the quiet to be able to achieve that on a much greater level. So believe me, the goal of the Seder is to have Seder, to have structure. So what else is, believe me, that's the whole point, the entire Seder. So I think the next thing that has to be so importantly said is that the Seder is about emunah. It was I have to say, it was very sad, to be honest. Not, God forbid, as judgmental, but I was sitting with some individuals in the community a little while back, UJA involved people in their 60s and whatnot, and we had a little session that they asked me to run. And they were talking about it from a cross spectrum of the community. And, we were talking, they said, like, Rabbi, like, it's great. I really love this. The family getting together, it's so important, or we can do it by Zoom. So I'm like, well, what's the goal? They're like, well, what do you mean? Like, we're bringing the family together. I'm like, family should always be together. And, this year it's tough, but, families, of course, importance of family. But the Seder, the storyline, if it's just family, we should just tell family stories, show family pictures, watch family videos, talk about the memories that we have in the albums. I said, it can't just be about family, right? So what's the goal? So I threw out, I said, you know what, guys, maybe, just maybe it has to do with our belief in God. Like emunah. Maybe the goal is as simple as it sounds, and that's why it's called very often emunah pshuta, simple emunah, right? Not complexities of philosophical understanding. But believe me, God says, that's the goal of the entire Seder, right? We can skirt around and find beautiful little vortlach, and yes, chesed's important with the halach ma'anya, and yes, understanding the differences between all the temperaments of kids and the daled, it's important, and yes, understanding the hakaras hatov, the appreciation we have about all the chesed that we've had, but core to the entire experience, right? When we don't get lost in the weeds and the specifics, the story is, the way the Arizal refers to the Seder and Nisan, he calls it Rosh Hashanah le'emunah. It's the new year for emunah. If I would say Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we know that's the new year for tshuva, right? Yes, there's lots of nice vortlach and lots of nice ideas. We can look into the tefillah, but when we show up, please God, this year in shul together for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we know what our job is. We know that it'll take some time to get there mentally, spiritually, emotionally, to be in a space of saying, you know what, it's time to have an honest, face-to-face with God and with myself. But I know that's Rosh Hashanah, it's a tshuva time. So the Rizal says Nisan, which is the first month of our years, is the Rosh Hashanah for emunah, right? There's a koach, a time for us to be able to strengthen what our anchor is in life. And if ever we've been through a year where we've seen that there's absolutely nothing we can rely on, with all due respect to the wonderful doctors that are on here, they were as confused as the rest of us, not knowing what or how this is going to work. And there's a blessing that's said before you take the vaccine to say, wow, it's amazing that we have the brilliance and the intelligence to be able to do things to get over that. But at core, we realize the whole world came to a standstill stop, and there wasn't anything that any of us could do. Like I saw on one of my friends' WhatsApp, taglines, they said everything is still in control, just not ours. Right? Emunah means HaKadosh Baruch Hu's got a plan. He's had a plan for the Jewish people throughout. He continues to have one, and that's the Jewish people as a nation and each individual on this planet as well. And therefore, I would say that the goal of the entire Seder, believe me, is God saying, believe me, is you've got to have that. And once you have that lens, then you don't need Perushim. Yes, use Perushim. All you need is a Haggadah. If we were to pull out a Haggadah right now and you start with, and again, you'll start to see these things jumping out at you. But if you pull out a Haggadah, right, starting right from the beginning, we were slaves, God took us out. You turn the page. What do you have on the next page? Baruch HaMakom. Blessed is God. You turn the page. What do you have? Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah. We used to be over Avodah Zarah. Achshav Kirvanu HaMakom LaVodaso. Now we're in front of Hashem to serve Him, to be part of His, Or Lagoyim. Baruch Shomer Haftachas Ol Yisrael. God, you kept your promise. We're still around, right? Every other person, Mark Twain, we mentioned him earlier. Everyone knows the famous immortality of the Jew. We shouldn't be here by all accounts of history, but God, you said we're never going to be destroyed. You're keeping good on your promise. We've come through some of the darkest times in history, and we're still as, if not stronger than ever. You turn the page. That same God who stood there for our forefathers and foremothers will stand for us. God says, I'm doing this one on my own. You won't even see Moshe. You won't see a Malach. We'll get to the Makos. He says, that was me. You know that. We'll get to Dayenu. You'll see all the things that I do. You'll turn the page. B'chol dor v'dor, every generation. God does this for me. Right? We turn the page. We say Hallel. We praise God for that. Then we say Asher Gal Lanu. Everything about the Seder screams out. If you put on the lens of Amunah, you realize that the goal of what we're supposed to achieve on this evening is simple. It's simple Amunah, is to have an understanding that there was a Borei Olam, is a Borei Olam, will always be a Borei Olam. Someone who created the world, continues to be involved in the world on a macro level and on a personal level as well for each individual. And if I can achieve that goal, whenever I go through anything, coming out of the toughest times Klal Yisrael had, right, of Mitzrayim in the Korah Barzel, 210 years, 100 years almost of horrible slavery beyond imagination, and we come out of that experience with tremendous emunah. Right? Emunah isn't bred from when things are going well. It's almost the opposite. They say a beautiful word. Why do we ask all these questions on why do we dip on Pesach? When else do we dip? Right? We also have dipping on Rosh Hashanah, the other Rosh Hashanah. We don't say, why on this night do we dip apple and honey? We don't really ask that question around the table. So I saw a beautiful Hasidic Shavort that says, well, that's simple. Because when things are going well in life, no one asks questions. Man, it's going well. Yeah, Baruch Hashem, everything's great. We don't even mean the Baruch Hashem, just everything's great. He says, when do people start asking questions? When things aren't so good. Then we have to explore. We have to try to deepen our emunah. Ve'emunascha balelos. Our emunah is strengthened during the nighttime, during the difficult time. This has been a process. The more people I speak to, if they've had the lens of being able to stay, sane and healthy during this time, they found tremendous opportunity for growth during these difficult periods because it forced them to focus on the areas precisely where they couldn't escape anymore. They were enslaved to whatever it was that they were surrounded by, and that was the reality in which they had to live. And therefore, the believe me, the Seder is all about this, is God saying, believe me. That's what the Seder is all about. But I think there's also a third believe me to this, right? We have a believe me of, trust me on this one, guys. I think this is good. There's a believe me, God saying, trust me on this, guys. I think we got it. But then there's the next stage of believe me, right? We have the obligation of the believe me that we say to the next generation as well, right? There's one aspect of the evening that is all about, obviously, the concept of Amunah. But Amunah alone isn't enough. We see this right from the beginning of Avram Avinu. When Avram Avinu, who we know has Amunah, right? We understand he believed in Hashem. But God said, look at all the stuff that you've done. You're my right-hand man. You're my main man, Avram. I'm choosing you. But the Torah says why God chooses Avram. It wasn't because he was a believer, right? If you look in the Chumash in Parshas Vayera, Perek Yud Ches, Pasuk Yud Tes, he says, Ki yedativ laman asher yitzave es bonav ve'es beso achrav. He says, Avram, I'm choosing you not because you're a great guy. Yeah, you're a great guy, but that's not enough. But I know you're going to command your children afterwards, v'shamru derech Hashem, and they're going to follow in my ways as well. Emunah is a one generation level. Mesorah with that emunah is what gives us our lasting continuity, our eternality. The ability to be able to pass it over to the next generation, which becomes so important. There's a beautiful pshat that the Chassam Sofer has in one of his drushos. If you look at when they're bringing the Korban Pesach, it says a language which I think this year resonates with us much more than in any generation, right? As they're sitting there and putting the blood on the doorpost, Makas Bechoros is going around outside. They're not allowed out. It says as follows. It says, right? We got them el mashkof. They go to the mashkof. El shtei mezuzos, and the two mezuzos min adam. So they put the blood on the doorpost. Asher besaf va'atem lo seitzu ish mi pesach beso ad haboker. And no one was allowed to leave their homes. Right? They were in bidud. They were in isolation ad haboker. And the Chassam Sofer says, well, what did they do that night? They weren't allowed to leave. This is their Pesach. It's their Haggadah. It's their seder. The first seder was held in Mitzrayim. And he says, great, put the blood on the doorpost, make sure mezuzahs are up there, lock the door, and no one's leaving until the morning. So Alpi, Mechilta, the Medrash says, why couldn't they leave? They said, because, also quite ironic, it says, because once the mashkis, once the magefa is out there, once the plague, the destruction is out there, anyone who's outside their homes, it doesn't discern between a tzaddik or a rasha. The only place they were safe was inside. So if you stepped outside, again, it takes on such different meaning in our days, right? But if you stepped outside, there was no protection. You had to stay inside. You had to stay home, stay safe. But the Chassam Sofer says, which I think also is a part of what we've experienced, is he said the reason why they had to stay home was because they had to get their house in order. He said, when that was happening out there and says, wow, look at all that God's doing out there for us. Do you realize that for the past 210 years, for your Zaydi and your Zaydas and your Bubas, they were all in Mitzrayim in this environment. We're getting out tomorrow. There's tremendous emunah at this moment. God says, now lock the door, stay in your house, and make sure that you get the whole house riled up to understand that. Because as soon as they get out, we know very quickly, and it's one of my fears. I speak to you honestly. One of the fears is that once it's over, we realize the importance of community. How many times people said, Rabbi, I just miss being in shul. My prayer is, and I have fear, as all rabbis have, that once we're able to come back, people will be like, nah, it should be the opposite. The hunger that we should have as a result of the clarity that's happened about how much community means and people means. As a result of that, it should fuel us forward. It's interesting. There's two aspects of dam that we have as part of our tradition, right? In a bris, there's someone here. I think the last bris I was in person was Max's, one of our newest members who had a baby boy, right? We say at the line, "B'tamaya chayi, b'tamaya chayi." We live with our blood. That phrase comes from Yecheskel. And Rashi says over there, what's this blood that's referring to that we live by our blood? It says dam Pesach and dam Mila. You have the Korban Pesach blood and you have the bris Mila blood. He says those two bloods saved the Jewish people. Rav Soloveitchik explains that those two bloods represent the two covenants, the connections we have to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The blood of the Korb of the Bris Milah, it's a connection of the individual, which it's important to have the individual personally connected. But the Korban Pesach is the Korban of the Klal, of the people. Everybody brings one. There's the aspect of an individual being strong, but as the individual is strong, they should use that to strengthen their collective connection to the community, to be there for each other. And that's why a person who is an Arel, who is uncircumcised, lo yochal, is not allowed to eat from the Korban Pesach. You have to have both of those aspects that are there, the personal connection, but you have to have the communal, the familial connection as well. And therefore, they were in their home until that moment that they could do that. So if the idea of Mesorah is there and Avram is chosen, even though he starts from Oved Avodah Zarah, Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah, Avram was an idol worshiper, right? So we think, oh, it's so tough and we don't have the right upbringing and maybe I went to Hebrew school. I didn't go to Hebrew school back then. It was hard, right? He did not have a Bather Street. He didn't have a Shari Tefillah. He didn't have Google that you can go on Chabad.com, Aish.com, Torah.com, Torah, whatever it is, Shas.com, everything at his disposal. He had nothing. Look where he started and look where he ended, right? We have that ability as well also. And then the second step is passing it on. And if we use that same lens then of the Mesorah being important, we went through the Haggadah in one way and said, wow, if you look through the Haggadah, you see all these things that are clearly just talking about Hashem. And I've got to meditate and think about that. I have my personal experience as an individual. And then when we think about the Mesorah aspect, we realize, wait, the whole Seder is the educational night par excellence. You got to tell the bincha. You got to tell it over to your kids, the Dalit Bonim. But Rabbi, I got this type of kid, that type of kid. My kid's kind of stubborn. He's older. He doesn't listen to me anymore. He's younger. He's this. He's too immature. He's too smart. He's not smart enough. He can't stand the stuff. It says it doesn't make any difference. Everyone's got to be around the table, right? Because the job is, it's the opposite. Everybody's got to be there. And the ones that we think that are the most off the path and there's no way they'll come back, we actually spend the most time with them. There's a beautiful vort that's said by, I apologize, I can't remember, but maybe it'll come to me. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, it just came to me, right? Everybody knows the famous Lubavitcher Rebbe story about, or Pshat, that there aren't 4 sons, there's 5 sons, right? It's really Alpi Kabbalah even more. There's always 4, but 4 is there's a hidden 5. Just like there's, 5 etzbaos, it's really 4 fingers and the thumb that's the grounder. We have 5 cups, right? It's not just 4. We have the koshel eliyahu. 5 always represents that extra aspect that brings the whole piece together. But it's the unseen very often. It's the separate. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe says you've got the 4 children around the table, but there's the 5th, the one you don't see, right? There's that one you have to pay attention to also. That part of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's teaching is very well known. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe has another aspect. He says that the Daled Banim, the 4 children, are connected to 4 cups of wine. And each cup of wine is connected another child. And he says that if that's the case, if you look at when we space out the four different cups, the first one we say Kiddush on pretty quickly and we drink it. And the second one's over the Haggadah, and that goes from the Haggadah all the way through. That's where the bulk of the seder is, right? All that time we speak and talk and talk and talk, right? Then we have the third one, we bench. Then we have the fourth one, we do at the end by Nirtza, right? And it's over. He says, if you look at the spacing of how much time we spend on each kos, the one that gets the most talk time, table time, attention is the second kos, right? That's the one we hold up for the longest amount of time. He says that one's keneged, right? The Russia, right? Don't spend all the time with the ones that are just the easy ones. Our job of being able to disseminate means we believe in every single person and always. We never give up. Each year we go through the process. Seil Mad, we say we're going to start again. And we spend time being able to give it over even to the hardest places. And there's 2 ways that we give things over, right? There's a beautiful, beautiful idea that's shared by Rav Boba in terms of how we raise the next generation. It's a combination of 2 different things. And we see it actually in 5 brilliant words in the Haggadah, which at first seem to be a complete contradiction. The Haggadah, as we might know, is based on the Gadata lebincha bayom hahu lemor. Right? The Haggadah, the Haggadah, you should tell it over to your children on that night, lemor saying. So there's a beautiful question, I believe, also asked by the Chassam Sofer. If you look at that pasuk, the Haggadah is a lashon of telling, and lemor is a lashon of telling. He says the only problem is those are 2 different forms of telling. We see that wording by v'kos tagid lebeis Yisrael, v'tomar, I forget the language of the pasuk. V'tomar lebnei Yisrael, I think, right? You should tagid. No, sorry, kosomar lebeis Yaakov v'tagid, right? You say it to the Beis Yaakov, right? And you tomar to the Bnei Yisrael. And Rashi on the spot says that those 2 words, v'tsomar, tomar means to speak gently. Tomar lebeis Yaakov means in that context, when you speak to the women, you speak benachas, you speak softly, right? Tagid, it says kashin kegidin. It's hard like gidin, like sinews. It says when you're speaking to Bnei Yisrael, they're an amksher, if they're a little bit stubborn, you got to speak strongly to them, right? So you have to speak to different people in different ways. So if that's the case, how do you have the gadata lebincha bayom hahu lemor? Are you supposed to speak strongly or are you supposed to speak softly? So Rav Wolbe says like this beautifully. He says there's always an aspect of visagi. The person has to have a sense of respect, the parent, for them to be able to give over. The child has to see them. The idea of kibbud avayim, of mora, of having fear and awe and appreciation of parents means that it shouldn't just be, hey, we're chummy chum, whatever you want to do. We set up structure. But the reality is we do that in order to lay more, in order that we end off being able to speak honestly, openly about what's important to us, what's really in our heart. When we gain the respect of the previous generation, then we can confide in them in terms of what really is valuable. And then we go through the whole Seder with those ideas, the Manishtana, the Daled Banim, we end off, right? We end off with Chad Gadya. And Chad Gadya, according to some of the commentaries, actually bookend these 2 goals of the entire Seder. The Chad Gadya, the little kid, the little child we start with. Once upon a time, there was a little child, right? And we end it off with, what do we have to do? The Asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes at the end. There's this sense of emunah. So I think when we take this opportunities we're about to in a couple of days from now, in obviously a very different environment, in a reality which is not the normal. But sometimes when there's a reset button and we don't focus on, wait, this is how we used to do it. These are all the details. What is the specific that I want to say? Or what's my notebook going to say? But rather we put that down before we start and engage in it. And we just say, what's the purpose? How do I know if I've been successful? Right, Baruch Hashem, we're blessed in Chutz La'aretz. We have 2 opportunities. I remember when I spent a year in Eretz Yisrael, I spent a couple of years. But for one of the sedarim, I won the lottery in Yeshivat HaKotel to spend it with Rav Nevinsal. Should live and be well, right? The Rav of the old city. And we were sitting down there, and he kibitzed with us, the couple of us guys who won the honor, the schus of sitting around Rav Nevinsal's seder table. And he said, "You guys are so lucky." I said, "Why are we so lucky?" He said, "Because it says in the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, the Balatanya teaches that the reason why chutz la'aretz, why you have to have 2 seders, is because you have to make up for the kedusha. You don't have as much kedusha in chutz la'aretz." He says, so you have to keep 2. He says, in Eretz Yisrael, we have more kedusha. He says, you guys now are in Eretz Yisrael, and you still have to keep 2. So you have the opportunity to go through it twice and on that heightened level, right? But he said there's an opportunity that we don't get in Israel of having 2 sedarim. We view it again as a burden, as a crutch. But if we say, you know what? There's so much time to be able to focus on things. How do I know that when the 2 days are over, that I've been successful, that I've achieved what I need? I have to go in knowing what my goal is. I have to say that I realize that so much is resting in the Jewish people and what happens in our own home. And I realize that when I go ahead and have that perspective, all of a sudden I open up the Haggadah, and I literally, it's like those glasses that you put on, you see God everywhere, right? And not only in the Haggadah, but once we take those lenses and we close Harizeh Meshubach after the story's over, right? We can start seeing God in every aspect of our lives, in the parts that are obviously sweet, but even sometimes in the bitter, right? The reason why the Maror comes at the end of the Seder is because in retrospect, a person can look back often in life and say, even the Maradic times, the difficult times that were there, you know what? That was part of the Geula as well. That was part of the redemption as well. It's not, thank God I'm past that, but thank God I was able to get through that to become the individual that I am, the family that I am, the community that we're meant to be, and the people that we're meant to be as well. May we be Zocha. I felt it last year. I feel it again this year. I felt last year that when we opened up the door, that Eliyahu could literally walk into our lives, into our hearts in a moment. We have Amunah. It's not make-believe. We don't know when it comes, and we say, Afal Pishis Vameim Kozeh Chakalot. Every second I wait for it. We're definitely living in times when we say Atzchalta de Geula, the beginning stages of Geula. Those aren't just words. It says, yeah, we sort of believe it. We've seen Nisim and Niflos after 2,000 years of coming back to Eretz Yisrael. We've seen individuals who've gone through the deepest, darkest, right, stages of Jewish history ever come out with an ability to still retain their emunah and possibly even strengthen it, and to be the forebearers of what we're the inheritors of afterwards. May we take all that collective energy that's been pent up in our homes, directed inwards to ourselves, directed outwards to those that are around us. When we get out, may we shine it to the entire community as well. And may we be zochet to not just sing Lashana Haba B'Yushalayim, but may Shari Tefillah with all of the Sharim, with all of the gates and all the shuls and all the communities. Be zochet next year to be B'Yushalayim Havniyah. We should be able to celebrate together the way it's meant to be, not with hard matzah and lettuce and where's the beef, missing the Korban Pesach in the middle, but we should be able to get together for a great steak sandwich the way it was meant to be in Yerushalayim. B'mher v'yameinu. Amen. Achad kosher v'sameach. I want to give a big thank you as well to our dear friend, Dr. Norman Scher, for being the generous sponsor of this. L'zecher Nishmas, his wife, Barbara Ruth Bas Avram. He's a tremendous, I just want to speak a little bit. I'm not sure if he's on here. I didn't see his name. He might not have been able to come on. But Dr. Norman Scher is an individual that through it all from the first second he was able to show up, is always there every single Shabbos, the first one that's over there. He sits in his seat. We make sure he's safe and comfortable. But he's like, listen, if I can come to shul, I'm coming to shul. Baruch Hashem, we're in a situation now where we can. If people do want to come, I encourage them to. We have so much space. We're so cautious and careful and respectful of people's, Daled Amos. There's six feet Amos around them. But it'll be wonderful to see everyone together the way it's meant to be, slowly over time until we're all back together. So Chag Kosher V'Sameach. If anyone has any questions, we can stick around afterwards. Really nice to see you and hope to see every single person in person soon.
Nice. Beautiful time.